$50,000 in crisp, unbanded hundreds sat stacked on the mahogany desk, promised to anyone who could open the oxidized brass lockbox without triggering the acid vial inside. 25 men in tailored suits and grease-stained overalls had walked in, confident, and left sweating. They used fiber-optic scopes, liquid nitrogen, and diamond-tipped drills. Nothing worked. Then a girl smelling of cheap bleach and exhaustion stepped forward with a lighter and a bottle of white vinegar. She didn't want the money. She just wanted them out of her way so she could mop the floor. Sweat beaded and dropped from the bridge of Miller's nose, splashing against the dulled surface of the antique brass lockbox. The sound of it hitting the metal was imperceptible beneath the high, whining shriek of the diamond-tipped rotary drill. Miller cursed under his breath. The drill bit bound, skipping off the scarred brass collar of the keyhole. A sharp spark shot sideways, singing the edge of a stack of important shipping manifests. The smell of ozone and burning metal hung heavy in the stifling air of the study. Dominic watched from the leather armchair in the corner. He hadn't slept in 72 hours. A muscle feathered beneath the heavy dark stubble along his jawline. His tie was loose, his collar open, revealing the faint, pale scars at his collarbone. He looked at the Rolex on his wrist. 11:42. 18 minutes. If that box wasn't open by midnight, the ledger inside remained inaccessible. If the ledger remained inaccessible, his brother would face the cartel's firing squad before sunrise. It was a simple, brutal equation, and Dominic felt the weight of it crushing his lungs. He reached for his rocks glass. The scotch was warm. He drank it anyway, letting the burn distract him from the throbbing pressure behind his eyes. "It's no use," Miller finally gasped, cutting the power to the drill. The sudden silence in the room rang in everyone's ears. The security contractor pushed his safety goggles up into his thinning hair, leaving red rings around his eyes. "Mr. Rossi, I'm telling you, this isn't a standard pin tumbler. It's a deadlock mechanism wired to a secondary glass vial. The vibration alone is risky. If I apply any more torque to the primary cylinder, the acid drops. The paper inside turns to sludge. I can't bypass it. Nobody can." Dominic didn't yell. He didn't throw the glass. He simply set it down on the side table with a quiet, terrifying click. "You are the 25th man to stand in this room and tell me what cannot be done," Dominic said. His voice was a rasp, low, and entirely stripped of emotion. "I brought you in from Chicago because you claimed you could open bank vaults with a paperclip. Now you're beaten by a humidor my grandfather bought in Naples." "It's a bespoke acoustic lock, sir. It's not just mechanical, it's—" "Get out!" Miller flinched. He started to reach for his canvas tool bag. "Leave the tools." Dominic's underboss, Caleb, rumbled from his position by the heavy velvet drapes. Caleb was a mountain of a man who always smelled faintly of peppermint and gun oil. He stepped forward, his massive frame blocking the only exit. "Just walk, Miller." Miller swallowed hard, abandoning his gear. He backed out of the room, closing the heavy oak double doors behind him. In the far corner, practically swallowed by the shadows of the towering bookshelves, Sadie squeezed the heavy cotton strings of her mop through the industrial yellow wringer. Water, murky and grey, splashed into the bucket. The sharp tang of industrial ammonia fought a losing battle against the scent of Dominic's cigar smoke and spilled scotch. Sadie's lower back throbbed. A dull, rhythmic ache radiated from her spine down to her knees. She had been on her feet since 4 in the morning, scrubbing baseboards in the East Wing, only to be dragged into the main study because Caleb demanded the mud, tracked in by the parade of failed locksmiths, be cleaned up immediately. They treated her like a piece of furniture. Less than furniture. Dominic Rossi at least looked at the leather couch when he sat on it. He hadn't looked at Sadie once. She dunked the mop again. The cold water bit at the split cuticles on her right hand. She winced, pulling her fingers back and wiping them on the thigh of her faded grey uniform. The uniform was 2 sizes too big, bought at a thrift store, and hemmed with safety pins. She didn't care about the lockbox. She didn't care about the $50,000 stacked neatly beside it on the desk. That kind of money wasn't real. It was cartel money, blood money, ghost money. What was real was the $240 she was short for her rent, and the fact that she still had 2 hours left on her shift. She pushed the yellow bucket forward. Its casters squeaked violently against the hardwood. Dominic's head snapped toward the sound. His dark eyes locked onto her, bloodshot and furious. For a second, the sheer violence radiating from the man pinned Sadie to the floorboards. She froze her hands, gripping the plastic handle of the mop so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Do you have to do that right now?" Dominic asked. The exhaustion in his tone was heavy, a physical weight that seemed to drag his shoulders down. Sadie stared at him. She wanted to say, "Your goon told me to clean the mud." She wanted to say, "If I don't finish this room, I don't get cleared to leave." Instead, she just stared at the puddle of muddy water Miller had left near the Persian rug. "No, sir," she whispered. Her voice was raspy from the chemical fumes. "I'll wait." Dominic turned away, dragging a heavy hand down his face. "Caleb," he muttered. "Call the guy in Brooklyn, the one with the thermal lance." "Boss, a thermal lance will cook the inside of the box in 3 seconds," Caleb argued, stepping away from the door. "Do we have another option?" Dominic snapped, suddenly slamming his fist down on the armrest. The leather groaned. "Midnight, Caleb. Midnight." Sadie stood perfectly still. The room was suffocating. She looked past Dominic, past Caleb, straight at the scarred brass box, sitting under the harsh glare of the halogen worklight Miller had left behind. The light illuminated the green oxidation on the metal, the thick layer of grime that had settled into the intricate floral carvings. The 25 experts had looked at it as a masterpiece of mechanical engineering. Sadie, however, looked at things differently. She looked at the world through the lens of dirt. And looking at the heavy brass rosette right next to the keyhole, she noticed something the men with the diamond drills hadn't. Sadie abandoned the mop handle. It clattered against the lip of the bucket, another loud intrusion in the tense silence of the study. Caleb shot her a venomous glare, his hand instinctively dropping toward the bulge beneath his tailored suit jacket. Sadie ignored him. She wiped her damp, chemical-smelling hands on her apron and took a step toward the mahogany desk. "Hey!" Caleb barked, stepping into her path. The scent of peppermint was overpowering now. "Back to the corner, sweetheart, or better yet, get the hell out of here." "The floor is wet," Sadie said. Her voice was barely a murmur, flat and devoid of the terror Caleb was used to inspiring. She pointed a cracked finger toward the desk. "I need to dry the perimeter of the rug before the ammonia eats the silk." It was a lie, but a plausible one. Caleb glanced at Dominic, seeking an order. Dominic was leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his face buried in his hands. He didn't wave her off. He didn't even seem to hear her. Sadie stepped around Caleb's massive frame. She approached the desk, moving into the pool of harsh white light cast by the halogen lamp. Up close, the lockbox smelled like old copper pennies and damp pine. The heat radiating from the lamp was intense. She pulled a microfiber rag from her back pocket and knelt, pretending to dab at a scuff mark on the wood floor near the desk's heavy carved legs. Her eyes, however, were fixed on the box above her. The 25 locksmiths had focused all their attention on the primary keyhole, a deep, complex cylinder filled with tiny brass pins. They had scratched the metal around it, trying to pick it, trying to force it. But Sadie's gaze drifted an inch to the right, to the decorative brass rosette molded to look like a blooming lotus. Through the harsh light, she saw it. The keyhole had a faint ring of pale, untouched brass around its inner lip, meaning a key had gone in and out of it, recently polishing the metal through friction. But the rosette was entirely crusted in a hardened, amber-colored residue. It wasn't rust. It wasn't oxidation. It was spilled, caramelized liquor and decades of cigar resin that had seeped into a hairline seam and crystallized into cement. She stood up slowly. "You're working on the wrong part," she said. The words slipped out before she could stop them. They sounded absurdly loud in the cavernous room. Dominic's hands dropped from his face. He stared at her. His dark, bloodshot eyes narrowed, trying to comprehend what he was looking at. A maid? A girl in an oversized uniform with messy hair and bleach-stained shoes. "What did you just say?" Dominic asked. The danger in his voice was no longer a dull hum. It was a sharpened blade. "I said you're working on the wrong part," Sadie repeated, her throat feeling like dry cardboard. She didn't back down, though her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She pointed at the box. "That keyhole. It's fake. It's a decoy." Caleb let out a harsh, barking laugh. "Right. Okay. The girl with the mop is an acoustic engineering expert. Boss, I'm getting her out of here." He reached out his thick fingers, grabbing Sadie's upper arm with bruising force. "Don't touch me," Sadie snapped, jerking her arm away. The sudden violence of her reaction surprised even her. She looked at Dominic, holding his gaze. "The keyhole is a decoy. There's no friction wear on the inner pins. Whoever owns this hasn't put a key in there in 50 years. But that decorative lotus flower next to it, it has a micro seam around the petals. It's a pressure plate. It's supposed to depress, but it can't." Dominic slowly stood up. He was tall, dominating the space, moving with a predatory grace, despite his exhaustion. He walked over to the desk and looked down at the box, then at her. "Why can't it?" "Because it's glued shut," Sadie said. "Someone spilled cognac or brandy on it decades ago. Mixed with the cigar smoke in this house, the sugar crystallized. It's basically cemented the pressure plate to the outer casing. Your guys were trying to pick a solid block of brass. They could have drilled that keyhole all night. It would never open." Dominic stared at the brass rosette. He looked back at Sadie. "And how do you know this?" "Because I scrub dried liquor off your baseboards every Tuesday," she said bluntly. Silence stretched. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed the quarter hour. 11:45. "Can you open it?" Dominic asked. "Boss, you can't be serious," Caleb protested. "Miller just said any talk will drop the acid." "Can you open it?" Dominic repeated, ignoring his underboss. Sadie looked at the $50,000. She didn't want it. She just wanted to prove to the men in the room that they were idiots. She reached into the deep pocket of her apron and pulled out a small plastic spray bottle and a cheap plastic cigarette lighter. "It doesn't need torque," Sadie said. "It needs heat and an acid base to eat the sugar." Before Caleb could draw his weapon, before Dominic could stop her, Sadie unscrewed the cap of her spray bottle. It was undiluted white vinegar, her secret for lifting hard water stains. She poured exactly 3 drops over the brass lotus. The liquid pooled in the microscopic seam. Then she struck the lighter. She held the small orange flame a 1/4 inch above the brass, directly over the vinegar. The liquid hissed. The smell of boiling vinegar and burnt sugar filled the air, acrid and sharp. She held it there for 10 seconds. 20. 30. The brass began to weep, a sticky, dark brown sludge, as the crystallized resin melted. Sadie clicked the lighter off. She didn't use a tool. She didn't use a diamond drill. She wrapped the hem of her thick cotton apron around her thumb to protect it from the hot metal, pressed her thumb directly onto the center of the lotus flower, and pushed hard. A loud, resonant clack echoed through the room. Internal latches disengaged like a series of heavy dominoes falling. The heavy brass lid popped open a fraction of an inch, releasing the dry, musty scent of ancient paper into the room. Sadie stepped back, wiping her thumb on her apron. She looked at Dominic. Dominic Rossi was entirely, completely speechless. He stared at the open box, then slowly raised his eyes to the exhausted, bleach-smelling girl standing in front of him. For the first time in his life, the boss of the city had nothing to say. Silence stretched until it became a physical pressure in the room, heavy and suffocating. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked a rhythmic, metallic pulse that seemed perfectly synced with the throbbing vein at Dominic's temple. He didn't blink. He just stared at the sliver of darkness between the heavy brass lid and the lip of the antique box. Slowly, as if approaching a live explosive, Dominic reached out. His knuckles were white. He pushed the heavy lid back. It shrieked softly on dry hinges, a sound like scraping bone. Inside, resting on a bed of faded moth-eaten velvet, lay a small black leather ledger. It was ordinary, unremarkable. Its edges were frayed, the leather cracked from age and neglect. Yet the air in the room seemed to shift the moment it was exposed, drawing all the oxygen toward that little black book. Dominic picked it up. He didn't open it immediately. He held it in both hands, his broad shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch as a breath he had been holding for 3 days finally shuddered out of his lungs. The faint metallic scent of his adrenaline mixed sharply with the lingering cloud of burnt sugar and vinegar. "Caleb," Dominic said. His voice was a rasp, barely audible over the hum of the halogen work light. "Yeah, boss." Caleb's voice was uncharacteristically tight. "Call Gabriel. Tell him we have the routing numbers. Tell him to pull the transfer to the cartel account immediately." Caleb didn't argue. He didn't hesitate. He pulled a burner phone from his breast pocket, the scent of peppermint and gun oil flaring briefly as he moved and stepped out into the dark, cavernous hallway to make the call. Sadie stood by the desk. Her thumb stung violently where the hot brass had burned her skin. She curled her fingers inward, hiding the red, blistering mark against the rough cotton of her uniform apron. She didn't look at the ledger. She didn't look at Dominic. She looked at her yellow plastic mop bucket, sitting awkwardly by the Persian rug, the grey water perfectly still. "I need to finish the floors in the east wing," Sadie said. Her voice broke the spell. Dominic snapped his head, up his dark, bloodshot eyes, locking on to her. He looked at her, as if she had just dropped out of the ceiling. He took in her thrift store uniform, the safety pins glinting under the harsh light, her scuffed, rubber-soled shoes coated in a fine layer of dust and dried floor wax. "You want to mop?" Dominic stated. It wasn't a question. It was a flat, disbelieving echo of her words. "My shift ends at 2. Sadie said, her throat tight. Panic, cold and sharp, was beginning to gnaw at the edges of her stomach. She had made a mistake. She had stepped out of the background. Maids were supposed to be ghosts. Ghosts didn't humiliate highly paid security contractors. Ghosts didn't save mafia bosses from cartel firing squads. "If I don't finish the East Wing, the staffing agency docks my pay for the entire night." Dominic stared at her. He set the black ledger down on the mahogany desk, right next to the neat, banded stacks of $100 bills. $50,000. "Take it," Dominic said. He gestured loosely toward the cash. "It was the bounty. You opened the box. It's yours." Sadie looked at the money. It was more money than she had ever seen in her life. It was neatly stacked crisp, the pale green ink stark against the dark wood of the desk. To a girl short on rent, it should have looked like salvation. Instead, it looked like a trap. "No," Sadie said. Dominic's jaw tightened. "Excuse me. I don't want it." Sadie took a step back, her wet shoes squeaking softly on the hardwood. "I just wanted your guy to stop drilling so I could clean the mud and go home." "It's $50,000, Dominic said, his voice dropping an octave, taking on that dangerous, quiet edge again. He wasn't used to being told no. He wasn't used to people turning down his money. You're wearing a uniform held together by safety pins and smelling of industrial bleach. Don't play proud with me. Take the money. Sadie's chest flared with a sudden hot spike of irritation. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from exhaustion and anger. I'm not playing proud. She snapped the words, tumbling out before her survival instincts could stop them. I'm playing smart. What exactly do you expect me to do with 50 grand in cash? If I deposit it, the IRS flags it. If I try to pay my rent with a stack of unbanded hundreds, my landlord calls the cops because he thinks I'm dealing. I ride the night bus back to a neighborhood where people get stabbed over a pair of shoes. If I walk out of here with that in my backpack, I'm dead before Tuesday. Dominic went completely still. He studied her. The irritation faded from his eyes, replaced by a sharp, calculating intensity that made Sadie's skin crawl. He was actually looking at her now. Not as a maid. Not as a fixture in the room. But as a puzzle he couldn't quite figure out. So you opened a deadlocked vault just to speed up your janitorial duties, he said softly. Yes. You're lying. I'm short on rent, Sadie blurted out. The absolute indignity of the truth tasted like ash in her mouth. She hated him in that moment. She hated his tailored suit, his warm scotch, his mahogany desk. I need $240 by tomorrow morning, or I get evicted. That's what I need. Not your cartel money, not your ghost money. Just enough to keep my landlord from changing the locks. Dominic reached across the desk. His large, calloused hand bypassed the tall stacks of hundreds entirely. He picked up a loose, unbanded stack resting near his rocks glass. With slow, deliberate movements, he peeled off 3 crisp $100 bills. The thick paper made a dry, rasping sound against his thumb. He held the 3 bills out to her. Sadie didn't move. The ambient hum of the halogen lamp felt deafening. She looked at the green paper, then up at his face. The dark stubble on his jaw caught the harsh light, highlighting the deep, exhausted lines around his mouth. 300. Dominic said, his tone entirely devoid of mockery. It covers the $240 for your rent, plus cab fare, so you don't have to ride the night bus with cartel money. Sadie hesitated. Her burned thumb throbbed. Her back ached. She stepped forward, reaching out with her left hand. Her fingers brushed his palm as she took the bills. His skin was surprisingly warm, rough with calluses that didn't belong on a man who sat behind a mahogany desk. The brief contact sent a jolt up her arm, sharp and unsettling. She quickly pulled her hand back, folding the stiff bills and shoving them deep into the front pocket of her damp apron. "Thank you," she muttered, her eyes dropping to the floor. She turned toward the yellow mop bucket, desperate to put distance between them. "What's your name?" Dominic asked. Sadie froze her hand, hovering over the plastic handle of the mop. "You don't need to know that." "You just saved my brother's life," Dominic said. The words were quiet, but they carried a massive, undeniable weight in the silent room. "I think I've earned a name." "Sadie," she said to the wall. "Sadie." Dominic tested the name, the syllables rolling rough and slow over his tongue. "You're wasting your time scrubbing baseboards, Sadie." "It pays the bills. Usually." She grabbed the mop handle. It was gritty, coated in the dried residue of cheap cleaning chemicals. She yanked the bucket backward, the casters shrieking violently against the wood floor. The heavy oak doors swung open before she could reach them. Caleb stepped back into the study. The massive underboss looked entirely drained, the aggressive posture he usually carried having melted out of his shoulders. "It's done," Caleb said, looking directly at Dominic. He ignored Sadie entirely. Gabriel intercepted the transfer. The cartel confirmed receipt. Leo is walking out of the warehouse in Tijuana right now. He's safe. Dominic closed his eyes for a long, slow second. A profound, shuddering relief washed over his features, erasing the predatory edge that had defined him for the last 3 days. When he opened his eyes again, they found Sadie. "Let her go, Caleb," Dominic ordered. Caleb frowned, noticing Sadie standing near the door with her bucket. "Boss, she heard too much. She saw the ledger. We can't just let some staffing agency temp walk out the front door. I said, let her go." The dangerous edge was back in Dominic's voice, sharp enough to cut glass. "She doesn't know what she saw. And if anyone asks, she was cleaning mud." Caleb shifted his weight, his hand resting near his jacket. He looked at Sadie, his eyes cold and assessing. He stepped aside, leaving the doorway clear. Sadie didn't run, though every nerve ending in her body screamed at her to sprint. She pushed the heavy yellow bucket through the massive oak doors, the plastic wheels thudding over the thick threshold. She walked down the long, dimly lit corridor of the mansion, the plush carpet absorbing the sound of her scuffed shoes. She pushed through the heavy service doors leading to the rear kitchens, abandoning the bucket by the industrial sinks. She didn't bother going to the east wing. She stripped off the heavy cotton apron, leaving it in a crumpled heap on a stainless steel prep table. The smell of vinegar and burnt sugar still clung to her skin, deeply embedded in the pores of her hands. She walked out the back service door into the biting cold of the November night. The air was sharp, smelling of wet asphalt and distant exhaust, a stark contrast to the stifling, expensive scents of the mansion. Sadie dug her hands into the pockets of her thin thrift store jacket. Her fingers brushed against the crisp, stiff edges of the $300 bills. $300. She had her rent. She had a cab ride home. She had survived. She walked down the long asphalt driveway, her shadow stretching long and distorted beneath the yellow glow of the security lights. The gravel crunched under her feet. She told herself she was safe. She told herself that tomorrow she would go to the staffing agency, ask for a different route, and never think about the scarred brass lockbox or the exhausted man in the tailored suit again. But as she reached the heavy wrought-iron security gates at the edge of the property, a sleek black sedan pulled up quietly alongside her. The passenger window rolled down with a soft, mechanical hum. Caleb sat in the driver's seat. He wasn't looking at her. He stared straight ahead at the dark, empty road. "Mr. Rossi doesn't like loose ends," Caleb said, his voice flat. "And he doesn't like people who outsmart his security contractors." He reached across the center console and tossed a small, thick piece of cardstock out the window. It fluttered in the cold air, landing face up on the wet asphalt near Sadie's shoe. "Be at that address tomorrow at noon," Caleb said. "Don't bring the mop." The window rolled up. The sedan accelerated its tail lights, bleeding red into the darkness before disappearing around the bend. Sadie stood shivering in the cold. She looked down at the wet asphalt. There was a matte black business card lying near her toe. No name, no logo, just a street address in the financial district and a suite number embossed in dark grey ink. She knew she shouldn't pick it up. Picking it up meant crossing a line she could never uncross. But the smell of vinegar was still on her hands, and the memory of Dominic Rossi's eyes calculating, seeing right through her invisibility, was burned into her mind. Sadie knelt on the wet ground and picked up the card. Morning arrived with the relentless hollow hammering of the radiator pipe in the corner of Sadie's studio apartment. The noise was a daily feature, accompanied by the faint metallic scent of rust and boiling dust. She lay on her thin mattress, staring at the ceiling where water stains mapped out continents that didn't exist. Her right thumb throbbed a dull, rhythmic burn beneath a cheap plastic bandage. She hadn't slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the heavy brass lid of the lockbox falling open and felt the sudden, terrifying weight of Dominic Rossi's calculating gaze pinning her to the floorboards. By 8, she was standing in the cramped, sour-smelling hallway of her building, knocking on her landlord's door. Jenkins opened it, wearing a stained undershirt, the smell of stale beer and cheap cigars rolling out of his apartment in a visible wave. Sadie didn't speak. She simply handed him the 3 crisp, unbanded $100 bills. Jenkins blinked, his greasy forehead wrinkling as he looked from the cartel money to her pale, exhausted face. He checked the watermarks, his thick fingers leaving faint, oily smudges on the clean paper, before grunting and shutting the door in her face. No receipt. No thank you. Just the sharp click of a deadbolt sliding into place. Sadie walked back to her room. She sat on the edge of the mattress and pulled the matte black business card from the pocket of her thrift store jacket. It was heavy cardstock, expensive. Running her uninjured thumb over the surface, she felt the subtle indentation of the dark grey ink. A street address, a suite number, noon. She looked at her digital clock. 9:40. If she went to the staffing agency right now, she could beg for a daytime shift, scrubbing toilets at the municipal courthouse or mopping the sticky floors of a discount cinema. She would go back to being a ghost. She would be safe. But her stomach clenched at the thought of the harsh fluorescent lights, the smell of industrial bleach, the aching void in her lower back, and the pathetic realization that next month she would be standing in front of Jenkins' door all over again, short on rent, praying for a miracle. She didn't want a miracle. She wanted control. At 10:30, she walked out into the biting November wind. The subway ride downtown was a sensory assault. The train car smelled of damp wool ozone and old garlic. Sadie sat stiffly, her hands wedged between her knees, listening to the agonizing screech of metal wheels against the tracks. She watched the people around her, tired commuters, staring blankly at their phones, avoiding eye contact, existing in their own isolated bubbles. Yesterday she had been exactly like them. Today the $300 in her pocket felt like a severing of a tether. She was drifting into dangerous waters, and she knew exactly how fast the current was moving. She emerged from the underground station into the financial district. The contrast was physically jarring. Here the buildings were sheer cliffs of glass and steel, slicing into the grey winter sky. The wind whipping off the river was colder here, funneled through the concrete canyons with a sharp, howling intensity. There was no trash on the sidewalks. No grime. Everything was polished, sleek, and fiercely intimidating. Sadie found the address. It was a towering skyscraper with a lobby clad in imported black marble. It looked less like an office building and more like a mausoleum for hedge funds. She pushed through the heavy revolving doors, instantly enveloped by the scent of expensive HVAC systems and faint citrus-infused floor wax. She approached the security desk. The guard, a man in a sharp suit with an earpiece, looked up. His eyes did a quick professional sweep of her faded jacket, her scuffed shoes, her messy hair. He opened his mouth to ask her for a delivery slip, assuming she was a courier who had lost her way. "Suite 4400. Sadie said, her voice dry and raspy. The guard frowned, typing something into his terminal. He paused. He looked back up at her, the mild annoyance in his eyes replaced by a sudden, rigid professionalism. Name: Sadie. The guard didn't ask for a last name. He didn't ask for I, did he? He simply reached under his desk and pulled out a blank white magnetic keycard. He slid it across the polished granite counter. "Express elevator bank on the left. Last car. It will take you straight up." Sadie took the card. The plastic was cool against her skin. She walked toward the elevators, her scuffed rubber soles squeaking faintly against the marble. It was a tiny sound, a microscopic rebellion against the oppressive silence of the lobby. She stepped into the polished chrome box, swiped the card, and felt her stomach drop as the elevator shot upward, carrying her away from the ground, away from the dirt, and straight into the stratosphere of Dominic Rossi's world. 44 floors above the chaotic churn of the city, the silence was absolute. It was the kind of expensive engineered quiet that made Sadie's ears ring. The elevator doors parted with a soft pneumatic hiss, revealing a reception area devoid of a receptionist. Instead, Caleb stood by a massive floor-to-ceiling window, his broad shoulders blocking out a significant portion of the skyline. He wore a different suit today, charcoal grey, impeccably tailored, but the faint underlying scent of peppermint and gun oil remained the same. He turned as she stepped off the elevator. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a greeting. He just gave her a slow, assessing look, as if searching for a weapon she might have hidden in the oversized pockets of her jacket. "He's waiting," Caleb rumbled, gesturing toward a set of heavy frosted glass doors at the end of a short corridor. Sadie didn't wait for him to lead the way. She walked past him, ignoring the instinct to shrink away from his sheer physical mass. She pushed open the glass doors and stepped into the main office. The room was vast, smelling of rich espresso and old leather. There were no bookshelves or antique lockboxes here. The space was hyper-modern, dominated by a massive live-edge walnut desk and panoramic views of the river. Dominic sat behind the desk. He looked different in the daylight. The crushing exhaustion that had weighed him down the previous night was gone, replaced by a coiled electric energy. He was clean-shaven, dressed in a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to the elbows, revealing forearms corded with lean muscle. He was looking at a sleek tablet, a half-empty espresso cup resting near his hand. He didn't look up immediately. He let her stand there, letting the sheer scale of the room and his absolute authority wash over her. Sadie refused to fidget. She crossed her arms over her chest, digging her fingernails into the fabric of her jacket, and waited. Finally, Dominic tapped the screen of his tablet and raised his dark eyes. They locked onto hers, sharp and unreadable. "You didn't bring the mop?" Dominic noted his voice smooth, devoid of the dangerous rasp from the night before. "You told me not to," Sadie replied, keeping her tone perfectly flat. "Though looking at the streaks on your windows, your window washers are using too much ammonia in their solution. It leaves a film." A faint, almost imperceptible smirk touched the corner of Dominic's mouth. It was gone a second later. He leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. "Have a seat, Sadie." She walked forward and sat in one of the low, uncomfortable designer chairs opposite his desk. The leather was cold. "You're wondering why you're here," Dominic said. "I'm assuming you didn't call me up here to ask for cleaning advice." "I have 3 forensic accountants on retainer," Dominic began, ignoring her dry remark. "I pay them exorbitant amounts of money to look at spreadsheets, bank routing numbers, and tax codes. For the last 6 months, one of my front companies, a high-end restaurant in Midtown, has been bleeding cash. A slow, steady hemorrhage. My accountants assure me the books are perfect. My security team assures me the vault is secure. The managers are loyal. Yet the money is vanishing." Sadie frowned, the internal contradiction of his statement catching her attention. "If the books are perfect, how do you know it's bleeding?" "Because I know how much liquor they pour, and I know how many steaks they order," Dominic said, his voice dropping into a low, deadly register. "The physical reality doesn't match the digital one. Someone is skimming, and they are doing it with such precision that my experts can't find the hole in the bucket." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the walnut desk. The intensity radiating from him was palpable, a physical force that pressed against her chest. "Last night, I watched 25 of the best security engineers in the country stare at a brass box and tell me it was impossible," Dominic continued. "They looked at the mechanics. They looked at the design. They missed the crystallized sugar, Because they don't know what dirt looks like. You do. Sadie felt a cold knot form in her stomach. You want me to look at your restaurant? I want you to get hired as a night cleaner, Dominic corrected. I want you to be invisible. I want you to walk through the kitchens, the stock rooms, the manager's office. I want you to look at the trash, the wear patterns on the floor, the inventory that doesn't smell right. You see the things people try to wipe away? I need you to find my leak. I'm a maid. Sadie set her voice tight, the reality of the danger suddenly crystal clear. I clean up mud. I don't hunt down thieves for the mafia. You are an analyst who uses a mop. Dominic fired back smoothly. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a thick white envelope. He tossed it onto the desk. It landed with a heavy, substantial thud. $10,000, just to look. If you find the leak, I'll multiply it by 5. You'll never have to worry about a landlord or a late bus again. Sadie stared at the white envelope. The smell of the espresso in the room suddenly felt nauseatingly rich. $50,000. Real money this time. Clean money. But the price was stepping entirely out of the shadows and into the crosshairs of whoever was brave enough to steal from Dominic Rossi. She looked up from the envelope, meeting Dominic's dark, unwavering gaze. She knew she should walk away. The survival instinct that had kept her alive on the streets screamed at her to run. Slowly, her burned thumb aching in rhythm with her heartbeat, Sadie reached across the desk and pulled the envelope toward her. Crisp edges of the thick paper bit into Sadie's palm. She didn't open the envelope. She didn't need to count it to know the weight of $10,000. It felt dangerously heavy, a dense anchor threatening to drag her straight to the bottom of the river. Dominic Rossi casually observed from his 44th floor window. She shoved the envelope deep into the inner pocket of her thrift store jacket, keeping her hand pressed flat against it. I start tonight, Sadie said. Her voice was steady, a stark contrast to the frantic, irregular hammering of her heart against her ribs. Dominic didn't smile, but a shadow of approval shifted in his dark eyes. He picked up his tablet, dismissing her with the seamless grace of a man who owned the world and everyone in it. Caleb will give you the address. Don't be late. And Sadie... He paused, looking back up his gaze, catching the harsh midday light pouring through the glass. Don't get caught. By midnight, the air inside Aura Dominic's flagship restaurant in Midtown smelled of bruised, basil-charred Wagyu fat and the sharp, sour tang of spilled champagne. The dinner rush had ended hours ago. The sous chefs had wiped down their stations, the floor managers had locked the registers, and the echoing, cavernous space belonged entirely to the night crew. Sadie wore a new uniform. It wasn't held together by safety pins, but it was just as shapeless, a stiff, dark blue polyester tunic that scratched mercilessly at her collarbone. The fabric smelled faintly of formaldehyde from the factory wrapping. She pushed a heavy grey industrial utility cart down the narrow hallway, connecting the main kitchen to the rear loading dock. Her cover was perfect, a staffing agency temp assigned to cover a sudden vacancy. Trent, the polished, perpetually sweating general manager of Aura, had barely looked at her when she arrived. He had pointed a manicured finger toward the utility closet, muttered something about not using abrasive pads on the imported marble bar, and walked away. To Trent, and to the remaining kitchen prep staff, Sadie was a ghost. She was a mop, a rag, a bucket of degreaser. She was the invisible machinery that reset their world for the next day. Sadie used that invisibility. She started in the main dining room. She didn't look for hidden safes or USB drives. She looked at the physical footprint of the room. Forensic accountants looked at numbers on a screen. Sadie looked at the dust under the wine racks. She noticed that the digital inventory manifest pinned to the stockroom clipboard claimed 40 bottles of a specific vintage Bordeaux had been sold that week. Yet when Sadie emptied the glass recycling bins, separating the clear from the green, She counted the corks and the heavy punted bottoms of the broken bottles. There were only 22. A digital ledger could be hacked, manipulated, or balanced with phantom numbers. But glass was physical. It took up space. It had weight. She moved to the kitchen, her scuffed rubber soles silent on the red quarry tile. The massive stainless steel prep tables gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. Sadie wiped them down with a mixture of hot water and quaternary sanitizer, the chemical smell burning the inside of her nose. She watched the people who lingered. She watched the prep cook who stayed an hour past his shift, supposedly deep cleaning the meat slicer, but spending more time glancing toward the walk-in refrigerator. She watched the loading dock security guard, who spent exactly 14 minutes every night in the alleyway, smoking a cigarette, leaving the heavy steel service doors propped open with a rubber wedge. But it wasn't until 2 a.m., when she reached the narrow corridor housing the commercial laundry bins, that the physical reality of the theft snapped into focus. Aura used a premium linen service. The tablecloths and napkins were heavy Egyptian cotton. At the end of the night, the busboys stripped the dining room and shoved the soiled linens into massive wheeled canvas hampers near the back exit, waiting for the morning truck. Sadie sprayed a rag with stainless steel polish and began wiping the exterior of the walk-in freezer door, positioning herself so she could see the hampers in the reflection of the polished metal. Trent, the general manager, emerged from his glass-walled office. He had taken off his suit jacket. His tie was loose. He didn't look like a man finishing a shift. He looked like a man executing a quiet, stressful task. He walked quickly down the hall, looking over his shoulder. He bypassed the kitchen entirely and went straight to the walk-in refrigerator. He emerged a minute later, pushing a small utility cart. On it sat 3 large, opaque white plastic tubs, the kind used for storing bulk rendering fat. Sadie kept her head down, scrubbing a non-existent stain on the freezer handle. Her pulse hammered a dry rhythm against her collarbone. Trent didn't take the tubs to the waste disposal chute. He pushed the cart directly to the heavy canvas linen hampers. With practiced frantic efficiency, he unlatched the lids of the white tubs. Even from 15 feet away, Sadie recognized the dark marbled brick of vacuum-sealed A5 Wagyu beef and the unmistakable soil-heavy scent of raw white truffles piercing through the smell of bleach. Trent buried the sealed packages deep into the center of the soiled linens, piling wine-stained napkins and heavy tablecloths over the stolen inventory. He wasn't hacking a bank account. He wasn't skimming the register. He was hiding tens of thousands of dollars of premium untraceable ingredients in the dirty laundry. The linen company truck would pick up the hampers at 5 a.m., bypassing security entirely because nobody checks the dirty napkins. The truck driver, clearly paid off, would divert the goods to the black market before delivering the actual laundry to the cleaners. The digital inventory would simply log the missing food as kitchen spoilage or prep waste. Sadie lowered her rag. The chemical burn in her nose faded, replaced by the cold, sharp clarity of realization. Dominic Rossi's 25 experts had failed because they were looking up at the data. They should have been looking down at the dirt. Fluorescent lights hummed a sickening yellow pitch in the empty dining room of Aura. It was 4:15 a.m. The street sweepers were rumbling down the avenue, outside their heavy brushes, vibrating the thick plate glass windows. Dominic Rossi sat alone in a curved leather booth in the darkest corner of the restaurant. He wore a heavy wool overcoat over a dark sweater, blending seamlessly into the shadows. He didn't have an espresso this time. A single rocks glass of amber liquid sat untouched on the pristine white linen tablecloth in front of him. He had received the text message from an untraceable burner phone 20 minutes ago. Just an address and a time. The heavy oak doors swinging into the kitchen pushed open with a soft sigh. Sadie walked out into the dining room. She was still wearing the stiff dark blue polyester uniform, but she had taken off her apron. Her hair was pulled back into a messy utilitarian knot strands, sticking to her forehead with dried sweat. She looked exhausted, her shoulders carrying the heavy, familiar ache of a 10-hour shift on hard quarry tile. She didn't approach him with the hesitant, terrified deference of his subordinates. She walked with a flat, heavy-footed pragmatism. In her left hand, she dragged a large, heavy, industrial black trash bag. It made a sickening, wet scraping sound against the imported hardwood floor. Dominic's eyes tracked the bag, a muscle feathering along his jawline. Sadie reached the booth. She didn't sit. She hoisted the heavy black bag with a sharp grunt of effort and dropped it directly onto the center of the pristine table. The heavy crystal rocks glass rattled. The fine Egyptian cotton tablecloth instantly absorbed a dark, wet stain from the bottom of the plastic bag. "What is this?" Dominic asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that barely disturbed the quiet of the room. He looked at the leaking bag, then slowly up to her face. "That," Sadie said, her breathing slightly uneven, "is your leak." She reached out her fingers, digging into the tough plastic, and ripped a massive tear down the side of the bag. The pungent, earthy smell of white truffles exploded into the stale air, immediately clashing with the scent of Dominic's scotch. Mixed with the truffles were heavy, vacuum-sealed bricks of premium Wagyu beef, 4 bottles of vintage Romane Conti wine, and 2 large, unmarked tins of beluga caviar. All of it was tangled up in a heap of wine-stained, dirty napkins and damp tablecloths. Dominic didn't flinch. He didn't gasp. He simply stared at the pile of raw fortune sitting in the middle of his elegant dining room. He reached out his large, calloused hand, brushing past a stained napkin, to pick up one of the heavy bricks of meat. He looked at the inventory barcode stamped on the plastic. They log it as spoilage in the computer. Sadie explained, her voice devoid of triumph. She sounded like she was reading a weather report. Or they claim the wine bottles were dropped and broken during service. The digital books balance perfectly, because the system is told the product is gone. But it doesn't go in the dumpster. The dumpster is checked by your security guards. Dominic set the meat down slowly. The linen service. Trent packs the hampers at 2 in the morning. Sadie confirmed, crossing her arms over her chest to hide the slight tremor in her hands. The dirty laundry goes out the back door at 5 a.m. Security waves the truck right through. Nobody inspects a 200-pound canvas cart full of sour-smelling wet towels. The driver drops the food at a secondary location before heading to the industrial cleaners. Trent is skimming $30,000 of physical product a week, right past your cameras. Silence fell over the table. The only sound was the distant wail of a siren bleeding through the thick windows. Dominic pulled a crisp white handkerchief from his overcoat pocket and methodically wiped the condensation and raw meat residue from his fingers. He didn't look angry. If anything, the deep, exhausted lines around his eyes seemed to ease, replaced by a cold, terrifying focus. "My accountants spent 6 months running algorithms to find a phantom bank account," Dominic murmured almost to himself. He tossed the soiled handkerchief onto the pile of stolen goods. "And you found it in 4 hours. Your accountants don't know what it feels like to haul 50 pounds of wet linen," Sadie said flatly. "They don't know the physical weight of things. When you spend your life cleaning up after people, you learn that nobody ever looks at the trash. It's the ultimate blind spot." Dominic finally looked up at her. The dynamic in the air shifted, heavy and electric. He wasn't looking at a maid anymore. He wasn't looking at a temporary asset. He was looking at a woman who understood the ugly, grinding mechanics of reality better than anyone on his payroll. "Trent is a dead man," Dominic said, casually, stating a fact rather than making a threat. "The linen driver won't make it to sunrise." Sadie's stomach plummeted. The brutal reality of Dominic's world crashed through the satisfaction of solving the puzzle. She had just signed Trent's death warrant. She swallowed hard, tasting the bitter tang of ozone and stale adrenaline. "That's your business," Sadie said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. She took a step back, her wet rubber shoes squeaking faintly. "I did the job. I found the leak. We're done." "Are we?" Dominic asked. He stood up slowly. He was a foot taller than her, his presence utterly dominating the space. He didn't move toward her, but the sheer gravity of his posture made Sadie feel pinned to the floor. He reached into the inner pocket of his overcoat and pulled out a thick, banded stack of $100 bills. Not an envelope this time, just raw, unhidden cash, $50,000. He tossed it onto the table. It landed with a heavy thud next to the ruined truffles. "You think this is the only blind spot I have?" "Sadie," Dominic asked, his voice dropping into a register that felt intimately dangerous. "My world is full of experts who only see what they are trained to see. They look at the ceiling. They never look at the floor." Sadie stared at the money. It was enough to move to a different city, enough to disappear. But looking into Dominic Rossi's eyes, she knew the terrifying truth. You can't disappear from a man who knows exactly how to look in the shadows. She had stepped out of the background, and now he was never going to let her return to it. $50,000 sat on the ruined Egyptian cotton, resting against a leaking package of raw beef and a mound of damp, sour-smelling napkins. Sadie stared at the thick paper band, holding the hundreds together. It didn't look like salvation anymore. It looked exactly like a heavy, perfectly fitted iron collar. Dominic didn't crowd her. He remained on his side of the table, his hand slipped casually into the pockets of his heavy wool overcoat, the faint, high-pitched whine of a street sweeper making its second pass outside, vibrated through the thick plate glass, rattling the empty crystal rocks, glass a fraction of an inch. "I don't want to work for you," Sadie said. Her voice cracked on the final word. Her throat felt coated in dust and dried bleach. "Everyone works for me, Sadie," Dominic replied softly. "Most of them just don't know it. The staffing agency that docks your pay, I own the shell corporation that signs their lease. The landlord you paid this morning, he pays protection money to my lieutenants so his building doesn't burn down. You've been living in my house your whole life. I'm just inviting you into the dining room." Sadie dragged her gaze away from the cash and looked at him. The sheer suffocating scale of his reach pressed down on her lungs. She dug her fingernails into the rough polyester of her uniform tunic. It was a cheap synthetic material that trapped her body heat and chafed against her collarbone. "I found your stolen meat," she said, her chest heaving with shallow, irregular breaths. "I proved your point. You can hire 20 new security firms to watch the floor instead of the ceiling. You don't need a maid." "I don't need a maid," Dominic agreed, pulling his hands from his pockets. He stepped out of the shadow of the booth, the harsh, fluorescent lighting catching the sharp angles of his face. "I need an auditor who understands the physical reality of dirt. My accountants look at spreadsheets and see numbers that balance. My enforcers look at men like Trent and see fear, assuming it means loyalty. They are all blinded by their own expertise." He gestured toward the rotting pile of luxury goods on the table. "You walked into my flagship restaurant, a place designed to overwhelm the senses, and you ignored the marble. You ignored the wine lists. You looked at the trash. You counted the broken glass. You noticed the wear patterns." Dominic took a slow step toward her. The scent of his expensive dry cedar cologne pushed back against the overwhelming odor of white truffles. "You see the seams where the world actually holds together. And more importantly, you see where it's fraying." Sadie took a step back, her scuffed rubber shoe squeaking violently against the hardwood. Panic, cold and sharp, coiled in her stomach. She thought of Trent sweating in the back office, completely unaware that the heavy canvas laundry carts he had packed 2 hours ago were currently sealing his fate. "You're going to kill him," she whispered. "Yes." Dominic didn't blink. He didn't offer a justification or a comfortable lie. "Trent stole from my family. He broke the fundamental rule of our ecosystem. Consequences in my world are not conceptual. They are physical, and they are final." Sadie swallowed hard. A wave of nausea hit her, hot and acidic. She closed her eyes for a brief second, trying to block out the sight of the raw marbled meat and the stack of cartel money. She was a girl who scrubbed baseboards. She took the night bus. She worried about eviction notices and the fluctuating price of eggs. She had no business standing in the crosshairs of a mafia execution, but as she opened her eyes, she realized the terrifying truth. The old world was already gone. Jenkins, her landlord, had taken the $300 without a word, but he would be back on the first of the month drunk and demanding more. The staffing agency would send her to another fluorescent-lit hallway to ruin her knees for minimum wage. That life was a slow, grinding death. Dominic Rossi was offering a different kind of death, but at least this one paid up front. The heavy oak doors to the kitchen swung open. Caleb stepped into the dining room. He stopped abruptly, his massive frame going perfectly still as his eyes fell on the table. He looked at the leaking trash bag, the vacuum-sealed Wagyu, the truffles, and finally the $50,000. He didn't ask a single question. The raw intelligence behind his brutal exterior processed the scene in 3 seconds. He looked at Sadie, and for the first time since she had met him, the condescension in his eyes was completely gone. It was replaced by a cold, guarded respect. "Boss!" Caleb rumbled, keeping his voice low. The linen truck just pulled into the alley. Dominic didn't look at his underboss. His dark eyes remained locked on Sadie. "Handle the driver. Send a crew to Trent's apartment. Don't make a mess." "Understood." Caleb turned and disappeared back through the swinging doors. Sadie flinched at the casual administration of violence. It was an invoice being processed, a line item being crossed out. "Pick it up, Sadie." Dominic said his voice, dropping into a quiet, absolute command. She stood frozen for a long moment. Her burned thumb throbbed beneath the cheap plastic bandage. Her lower back ached with the familiar, dull pain of a 10-hour shift. Slowly, deliberately, she reached out. Her fingers brushed the damp, wine-stained cotton of the tablecloth as she grabbed the thick stack of bills. The paper was cold. It was heavy. She shoved it deep into the pocket of her cheap jacket. "I need a different uniform," Sadie said, her voice flat and entirely drained of emotion. "This polyester gives me a rash." A faint, dangerous smile finally broke across Dominic's face. He reached into his coat and pulled out a sleek, matte black burner phone, placing it on the edge of the table where the money had been. "Get some sleep, Sadie," Dominic said, turning his back on her to walk toward the front exit. "I'll call you when I find another mess." Sadie stood alone in the hum of the yellow light. She picked up the phone. It felt like a stone in her palm. She turned and walked out the back service doors, leaving the mop, the bucket, and her invisibility behind forever. A cheap lighter, a bottle of vinegar, and an eye for the dirt nobody else wanted to see. Sadie stepped out of the shadows to pay her rent, but she ended up exposing a massive cartel theft and catching the eye of the city's most dangerous man. Now she's no longer scrubbing floors. She's Dominic Rossi's secret weapon. But in a world where mistakes are paid for in blood, how long can she survive before she becomes the mess that needs cleaning? If you loved this grounded, gritty mafia thriller, hit that like button, share the video with your friends, and subscribe for the next intense chapter of Sadie's story.